Colombia's National Strike Committee and the government failed to reach an agreement as they met again this Tuesday, with new mobilizations called for Wednesday. BRICS group held a virtual meeting to support proposals by India and South Africa to temporarily waive patents on COVID-19 vaccines. Canadian Indigenous groups are urging a nationwide search for mass graves after evidence of genocide was found at a former boarding school run by the Catholic Church. From the headquarters of TeleSUR English in Havana, Cuba, this is From the South. I'm Gladys Quesada. And now we begin with the news. Colombia's National Strike Committee and the government failed to reach an agreement as they met again this Tuesday, with new mobilization called for Wednesday. The Strike Committee denounced that the government insists on militarizing the country in response to the protests, while it to present excuses to avoid negotiations to meet the population's demands and to resolve the social unrest. This Tuesday, the government presented a new document on warranties that endorsed the pre-agreement reached between the two sides on May 24th, which it has since refused to sign. Prior to the latest meeting, the committee announced it will remove some of the roadblocks set up in the framework of the nationwide mobilizations as a demonstration of the willingness to reach a negotiated solution to the national strike mobilizations. But the government has refused to sign any agreement until all the roadblocks are dismantled. Northwestern federal state of Táchira. They had been abducted by a Colombian armed group and rescued by the units of the Bolivarian National Armed Force at an undisclosed location in the state of Apure, bordering Colombia, where Venezuelan troops have been fighting Colombian irregulars. The successful rescue operation was dubbed Centennial Hawk. An Australian court will decide this week on the declassification of intelligence archives about the role played by Australia in overthrowing the Chilean Democratic Socialist government of President Salvador Allende in 1973. The court order is being sought by a former Australian intelligence agent who believes the country helped in overthrowing Allende and imposing a bloody dictatorship. For a long time, it was believed that military coup of General Augusto Pinochet was imposed on Chile solely on orders from the United States President Richard Nixon on behalf of transnational corporations. But later reports also implicated the United Kingdom and now Australia. Allende's government lasted only 3 years, in which it nationalized the country's national resources and the strategic enterprises and implemented a wide agrarian reform. The Australian court hearing will be held Wednesday and Friday in Sydney. Perus Interior Ministry has banned election campaign closing rallies ahead of the presidential runoff to be held on Sunday due to the COVID-19 epidemic. Both candidates, leftist Pedro Castillo and far-right Keiko Fujimori, the daughter of former dictator Alberto Fujimori, were planning to hold their campaign closing events on Friday. However, the mayor of Lima, Jorge Muñoz, warns of the impossibility of granting permits for public acts that gather a large number of people due to the pressures and the measures to fight the coronavirus. The Deputy Minister of Internal Order of the Interior Minister, Carlos León, told the local reporters that according to legal regulations regarding the health crisis, it was not possible for the authorities to grant permission to hold rallies, as requested by the different parties. The government resulting from this weekend's election in Peru will have to face an economic crisis aggravated by the pandemic that has left more than 3 million people out of work and increased poverty by 1.8 million, according to the International Monetary Fund. Our correspondent, Veronica Insausti, brings us more details about the current situation in the country.
8.5 out of every 10 workers are in the informal sector. One of the worst consequences of the pandemic was the paralyzation of economic activities, reaching 62% of the gross domestic product. More than 500,000 small and medium-sized businesses went bankrupt.
The economy shrank last year by 11.4%, and obviously this is reflected in the drastic fall in employment, both formal and informal. If we talk about figures, we are referring to 3 million new unemployed, and to this we add the effect of the pandemic on people's health and obviously the lack of health care services by the state.
Burnell believes that the next government should implement emergency public policies to prioritize the 85% of informal workers over the traditional measures that have not solved the economic crisis.
But the question is whether there is a light at the end of the tunnel, and that is still not there. There is a reactivation plan that has been implemented since May last year, but apparently it has not achieved the expected results, and so people are still waiting for options, and it is in this context that polarization is taking place in the second round of elections here in Peru.
The economic proposals of candidates Fujimori and Castillo are completely opposed. While the candidate of Popular Force insists in keeping the current state of affairs, the leader of Free Peru proposes a model of nationalization and state intervention. The fact is that the country that they are going to take over has a serious institutional problem, and the macroeconomic stability of the last decades has not had any real positive impact on the population, according to The Economist.
That connection is the one that has not occurred in the last 20 years in Peru, because the leaders have not made that kind of reforms, maybe because of corruption. Then the second task is to start implementing those reforms, but such reforms do not have an immediate impact. So what is to be done in the meantime? We will have to design a plan to support small businesses. That's where most jobs are created. Provide direct support to the population, because what people do not have is money. They have no money and are desperate because they have nothing to eat.
The new government will inherit a state with a public debt of 36%, weak institutions, and a tax administration body focused on taxing 15% of formal workers out of the entire population. Reactivating the economy of the vast majority at a time of health and economic crisis will be a challenge that will require political consensus beyond political preferences.
Verónica Insausti, TeleSUR, Perú.
And we'll be right back after this very short break, so don't go away. Welcome back to From the South. Foreign ministers of the world's 5 major emerging economies, known as the BRICS group, held a virtual meeting on Tuesday. BRICS foreign ministers noted that waiving off patents will facilitate the production of therapeutic vaccines and wider distribution, especially to developing countries. The 5 ministers noted that there are many challenges facing the world, including the lack of coronavirus vaccines for developing countries. South Africa and India are campaigning with the World Trade Organization to temporarily waive intellectual property rights.
Have submitted a proposal to the WTO for a temporary waiver of certain aspects of TRIPS to facilitate wider access to technologies needed to produce vaccines and treatments and diagnostics so that poorer countries with capacity could produce. Agreement will allow use of intellectual property, the sharing of technologies and technology transfer, and the production of vaccines, therapeutics, and wider distribution so that we achieve the ambition of none of us are safe until all of us are safe. We must address this global gap of vaccine access.
This Tuesday, the World Health Organization approved the Sinovac COVID-19 vaccine for emergency use, the second Chinese jab to receive the WHO's green light. The United Nations Health Agency signed off of the 2 doses of vaccine, which is already being used in several countries around the world. Last month, Sinopharm became the first Chinese vaccine to be approved by the WHO. The organization has also given emergency use listing to vaccines made by Pfizer, Moderna, Johnson & Johnson, and AstraZeneca. Apart from China, the countries using Sinovac include Chile, Brazil, Indonesia, Mexico, Thailand, and Turkey.
I'm happy to announce that the Sinovac CoronaVac vaccine has been given WHO emergency use listing after being found to be safe, effective, and quality assured following 2 doses of the inactivated vaccine. Furthermore, the easy storage requirements of CoronaVac make it very suitable for low-resource settings. It's now the 8th vaccine to receive EUL by WHO.
The World Health Organization voiced deep concern on Tuesday regarding the COVID-19 situation in South America, warning that outbreaks in the already hard-hit region were once again worsening. 8 of the 10 countries reporting the highest coronavirus mortality rates in the last week were in the Americas.
Countries represent 4 of the top 10 countries globally, just in case incidents over the last week. Those countries include Paraguay, Uruguay, Argentina, Colombia, Brazil, followed by Bolivia, Peru, and Chile. So there are real challenges in South America still, and mortality, has increased in some countries, particularly in Paraguay and Bolivia, by over 20% in the last week. And when you look at case fatality rates in South America in general, they are higher than in many parts of the rest of the world, ranging from 3 to 5%. And again, that may reflect severity of disease, but it also reflects access to adequate health care and the pressure that the system has been under in many South American countries for a very long time, despite the wonderful efforts of healthcare workers and healthcare systems to do that.
President Jair Bolsonaro confirmed on Tuesday Brazil will host the Copa America, despite being the country in Latin America with the highest cases of COVID-19 infection and the highest death rate.
That as far as the federal government was concerned, following the same protocols, we were in a position to host the Copa America in Brazil.
And Algeria has partly reopened its skies to commercial flights after 14 months of closure to try to keep out the coronavirus. The reopening has been extremely cautious, with limited flights and strict requirements for passengers. Those heading to Algiers must be a negative COVID-19 PCR test conducted less than 36 hours before boarding, and all passengers must undergo a 5-day quarantine in a hotel requisitioned by the state. The number of weekly flights and destinations is limited to 5 cities: Paris and Marseille in France, the Spanish city of Barcelona, the Tunisian capital, Tunis, and Istanbul. The OPEC group of oil producers and their allies agreed to continue with previously agreed output increases until July, but a decision is yet to be made on August. The 23-nation OPEC Plus alliance had implemented sharp output cuts to support prices after the coronavirus pandemic crushed the global economy last year. But as demand and oil prices have recovered and the health situation improves in developed economies, the group has started implementing more generous production increases. At the end of a short meeting on Tuesday, which lasted barely half an hour, the group agreed to continue rises up until July, adding up to 1.2 million barrels per day, to which will be added a further million barrels per day, which had been voluntarily withdrawn by Saudi Arabia. However, the alliance took no decision on what policy to follow from August onwards, and did not discuss the possibility of Iranian oil returning to the market in the coming months. Russia assured on Tuesday that it will maintain the agreement on the transit of Russian gas to Europe through Ukraine. Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov claimed that Russia and Ukraine have a treaty on the transit of gas to Europe, which will continue to be observed for as long as it is in force. At the same time, confirmed that Moscow has no intention of leaving Ukrainian transit. Peskov also informs the Russian President Vladimir Putin foresee that the volumes of gas supplied to Europe will increase in the future. Egypt rejects Ethiopian Prime Minister's statements on building 100 dams within a year on the Nile River. Egypt affirmed on Tuesday that the statements of the Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed on the construction of 100 new dams in his country violate international law and demonstrate that the authorities of Addis Ababa advances malicious transactions with the Nile and other international rivers. Ethiopia plans to hold 13.5 billion cubic meters of water during the second filing of the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dams Reservoir in July, despite the objections of downstream countries Egypt and Sudan over the move in absence of a legally binding agreement. And we have more stories coming up after this final short break, so stay with us. Welcome back to From the South. Canadian Indigenous groups are urging a nationwide search for mass graves after evidence of genocide was found at a former boarding school run by the Catholic Church. 215 Indigenous children were secretly buried in the schoolyard at the Kamloops Indian Residential School in British Columbia that closed in 1978. Some of the remains were from children as young as 3 years old. Indigenous boys and girls were forced to join these schools run by the church to be assimilated into the culture of British colonial rulers. Denounced as a means of cultural genocide, it now seems the plan was to annihilate them as part of an ethnic cleansing program.
Was the home residential school since the 1890, and we all know that many of our consultants and relations came to residential school not by choice, but were students there. And we also do know that many of the students have went missing as well. And our consultants, they can definitely share in those stories and have shared in those stories. And, what I've heard from many of them is the fact that, the ones that they know were missing and never came back were told that they ran away. So, that still haunts. And, a lot of those triggers have popped up with this year find of 215 children.
We are calling on the federal government to do something concrete. The Liberal government can't, on one hand, grieve this horrible tragedy, this horrible loss, while they are still taking Indigenous kids to court, while they're still taking survivors of residential schools to court. So we are calling on Justin Trudeau to stop taking Indigenous kids to court. When a human rights tribunal has found that Canada did not adequately fund Indigenous child welfare, they should not be taking these kids to court.
In Pakistan, 8 people, including 4 soldiers, were killed and 15 others injured in attacks in the southwestern province of Balochistan. According to a military statement, the attacks took place near the provincial capital Quetta and in the town of Turbat as Prime Minister Imran Khan was due to visit the region this Tuesday. In the first incident, a security forces checkpoint on the outskirts of Quetta was attacked by gunmen. In the second attack, an improvised explosive device targeted a paramilitary forces vehicle in Turbat, west of Karachi, the country's largest city. Balochistan is Pakistan's largest, least populated and least developed province and has been the site of an armed separatist campaign by rebels for at least a decade. In a statement, the Balochistan Liberation Army claimed responsibility for the attack in Turbat. Kuwait's Emir Sheikh Nawaf Ahmed Al-Jaber Al-Sabah met with Palestinian Prime Minister Mohamed Salah in the Kuwaiti capital on Tuesday. The Palestinian premier briefed the Emir on the latest political developments and the Israeli violations against the Palestinian people, especially in Jerusalem, in addition to the efforts made to achieve national reconciliation, mobilize support for the reconstruction of the Gaza Strip, and to create a political path in the light of the international momentum supporting the Palestinian cause to end the occupation and establish an independent Palestinian state. Almost 400,000 people have been displaced from the Democratic Republic of Congo's city of Goma following the eruption of the Nyiragongo volcano. Many fled to Rwanda following the eruption of the volcano, where they are being sheltered in a camp set up by the UN's refugee agency. Residents began returning home in the days following the eruption, by authorities then ordered to evacuate the city on May 27th towards surrounding regions, as strong aftershocks caused several buildings to collapse and sparked fears of a further disaster. This Tuesday, life was gradually returning to normal in Goma, even as emergency officials insisted it was still not safe to return. Meanwhile, according to the UN Refugee Agency, 350,000 evacuees are in need of emergency help.
And the tremors were horrible. At night we could not sleep, and during the day houses would just collapse. We saw flames exploding from Nyiragongo volcano at midnight. The fire was raging, killing people and destroying fields and crops, as well as houses and villages. We then fled to Rwanda to save our life. All our belongings were destroyed, including all the household things and all the food we had in our houses. All our goats were killed. We left everything behind.
Clashes were reported this Monday at the Parliament of the African Union based in South Africa. A heated argument occurred between the deputies of the chamber representing 55 countries of the African continent. The dispute was generated around the ballot box, since no agreement was reached on who should be the next president of the chamber. Since the PanAfrican Parliament was formed in 2004, there has been never a president from the south of the continent. The last two came from East Africa. The vote has been suspended for now. And we have come to the end of this news brief. But remember, you can find this and many other stories on our website at telesurenglish.net. And also, if you feel so inclined, please follow us on social media. We're on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and Telegram. For TeleSUR English, I'm Gladys Quesada. Thank you for watching.